Welcome everyone to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Thanks for joining us today. We're very excited to be hosting a talk today with Christopher Carothers, who's a political scientist conducting research on authoritarian politics with a regional focus on China and East Asia. His research has been published in many academic journals like Perspectives on Politics and the Journal of East Asian Studies and the Journal of Contemporary China, as well as popular outlets such as the Journal of Democracy and Foreign Affairs. Dr. Carothers received his PhD in government from Harvard University in 2019, and he's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Center for the Study of Contemporary China. More importantly, he was a postdoc here at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law a few years ago, which is where he did a lot of the writing of this book. And we're very excited that his current book, Corruption, Control, and Authoritarian Regimes, Lessons from East Asia, is now available with Cambridge University Press, and that's what Chris will be discussing today. Chris.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm Chris Carothers. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started here. Okay, so can everyone see this? Is it working? Looks like it. Yeah. Okay. My talk today is entitled, What Has Xi's Anti-Corruption Campaign Accomplished? And as was just mentioned, this is based on my book, Corruption, Control, and Authoritarian Regimes, Lessons from East Asia. It's out now from Cambridge University Press, so if anyone is interested, please check it out. Okay. Government corruption, when it becomes widespread, is well known to have a host of negative consequences. Corruption weakens governance. It makes it more difficult for the state to function. It undermines economic growth, causing distortions and inequality. And corruption angers the public. High-profile instances of bribery or embezzlement threaten the political legitimacy of a ruling government. And those consequences of corruption that I just mentioned apply not only in democracies where the government is accountable to the public, but also in authoritarian political systems. Chinese President Xi Jinping, when he first came into office 10 years ago, frankly admitted that corruption posed a major threat to his regime. He said, "A mass of facts tells us that if corruption becomes increasingly serious, it will inevitably doom the party and the state. We must be vigilant." So despite the fact that corruption has these well-known negatives and that autocrats are promising to do something about it, I find it very interesting that there is still a large conventional wisdom among many scholars and analysts of authoritarian politics that basically autocrats love corruption, that for autocrats, the benefits of corruption far outweigh the potential costs. And there are some good reasons to think this. A lot of past scholarship has shown that autocrats use corruption not just to enrich themselves through buying yachts and mansions, but also as a key political tool. They use corruption to maintain their rule, and they distribute spoils strategically in return for loyalty from certain elites. This is the kind of conventional wisdom that's really well captured in The Dictator's Handbook, this influential book that was published about 10 years ago. And I find the subtitle of the book particularly interesting. It's Why Bad Behavior is Almost Always Good Politics, right? So a big part of that in the book and in a lot of thinking about authoritarian politics is that corruption is good for business. Not just that, it's good for politics. Any kind of anti-corruption you might see, like an autocrat, like Xi Jinping promising that he's going to do right and he's going to curb corruption, it's probably fake. It's probably about purging political rivals, calling them corrupt and then getting rid of them. And so it's not to be trusted. Even if an autocrat somehow wanted to curb corruption, there's another part of the conventional wisdom that suggests that this is unlikely. And that conventional wisdom says that to curb corruption, what's really essential are strong democratic institutions, the rule of law, competitive elections, checks and balances, public oversight from civil society. All of these things we know constrain power and create accountability mechanisms that disincentivize abuses of government office. Now, autocrats, of course, they reject these democratic features of government. They don't want to be checked by an independent judiciary or the public, because then their own corruption could be exposed. They're not going to subject themselves to scenes like this one, a massive protest in South Korea that was part of the candlelight protests that opposed the corrupt presidency of Park Geun-hye in 2016, 2017, and actually succeeded in ousting her. Autocrats aren't going to have that. So there are lots of good reasons to agree with the conventional wisdom that autocrats are very unlikely to seriously curb corruption and to address this problem of corruption, whatever the costs may be. However, despite this kind of conventional wisdom, in my research, I find that substantial anti-corruption efforts by authoritarian regimes are more common and more successful than is widely assumed. I find that there have been dozens of national level authoritarian anti-corruption efforts in recent decades, including at least 10 cases in which I identify really successful reforms that have brought down the level of corruption and had all sorts of consequences for those political systems in those countries. To give you a sense of what some of those are, here are some examples of authoritarian anti-corruption efforts over the decades. There are many failed efforts, but also some successful reforms. And you can see here, you don't need to read all of these, but you can see here that different kinds of authoritarian regimes have tried at different times to curb corruption. There are military regimes and civilian regimes. There are communist regimes and anti-communist regimes. Probably the best known case here is that of Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew. And many people, if they think of a clean dictatorship or an authoritarian regime that really works, they think about Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew. But what I want to say is that this phenomenon of authoritarian anti-corruption isn't just a Singaporean fluke. It's a broader phenomenon that we need to analyze and really understand. So with that in mind, in my talk today, I'm going to focus on an important and contemporary case, and that's Chinese President Xi Jinping's major anti-corruption campaign in China. And I'm going to talk about the motives of this campaign. I'm going to talk about its outcomes. I'm going to discuss its methods, and then I'm going to address its implications. And after doing all that, I'm going to zoom out to talk a little bit about my book and how it discusses this issue more broadly, looking at anti-corruption around the authoritarian world. And then I'm going to have some conclusions, and we're all going to be done. My main arguments are as follows. So first, over the last decade, Xi's campaign has succeeded in reducing, though not eliminating, corruption. This is a very simple point, but I think it really bears highlighting, given how much research on this topic is focused on other issues and doesn't just look at the campaign as an anti-corruption campaign. Secondly, I argued that Xi has succeeded not through greater democracy, not as we might expect by moving China in a less authoritarian direction, but rather through a decidedly authoritarian approach to the control of corruption. And I'll talk more about what that approach really looks like. So let's dig into the campaign. So Xi's anti-corruption campaign was very much the signature domestic policy in his first term and afterwards. This has been a really sweeping campaign that has affected every province, every bureau, and every economic sector in China. And it's also a very complex campaign. It's one that has evolved in different phases of enforcement, right? First focusing on state-owned enterprises, then shifting to focus on certain provinces, then addressing certain government agencies more, sometimes moving to combat corruption in the Belt and Road Initiative. It's got all kinds of different stages of enforcement. So this is a very complex campaign. What motivated this campaign? Well, since it began, there's always been a skeptical perspective about it. And the skeptical perspective goes something like this. This campaign is really a mix, some kind of mix of Xi Jinping purging his political rivals, factional conflict within the Communist Party, and a kind of political theater that the regime is putting on for the public to convince them that it's doing something about this big problem of too much corruption. Against this skeptical perspective, however, I would argue that purging rivals and broader reforms are not mutually exclusive. So yes, Xi has used this campaign to strengthen his political position, But he's also used it to enact broader reforms that have addressed corruption throughout the state. Just power consolidation as a motive doesn't explain the campaign's incredible length, its scope, and frankly, its complexity. And I think that's why most experts who have studied the campaign accept that curbing corruption is at least among its main goals, and that continues to be the case. So what do I argue has motivated this campaign, if not narrow political interests? Well, I just mentioned that there could be many different motives, but I think an overarching important one is that Xi has really sought to curb corruption as part of his mission to strengthen the Chinese party state, to improve its organization and discipline. And this is a theme that Xi and other party leaders have come back to time and again since he took power, that the Chinese party state is in dire shape and needs to be dramatically strengthened, and that curbing corruption is going to help do that. So why was it so urgent for the Xi administration to do that? Well, I think this isn't always exactly spelled out, but the biggest fear that Xi and other party leaders have is that China will experience a kind of Soviet-style collapse. And in the late 2000s, under Xi's predecessor, Hu Jintao, many party members and officials began to see something like that. They saw a looming governance crisis that had three features that were unfortunately reminiscent of the Soviet Union in the 1980s. And those features are ineffective leadership under the Hu Jintao Wen Jiabao administration, rising public discontent over a lot of different policy outcomes, including corruption control, and a kind of excessive liberalism. The Chinese people were just too free to express their criticisms of the government and too able to organize, especially on the internet, under Hu Jintao. And this kind of combination is seen by Chinese analyses as what was happening in the Soviet Union that led the party to become weak and the Soviet Union to fall apart. So that's a long way of saying that why did Xi curb corruption if the public couldn't force him to through elections or through public pressure like in a democracy? Well, to strengthen the Chinese party state, because he and other leaders see that as essential to preserving their regime over the long run. Has this campaign worked? Well, that's a simple question, but it raises immediately another one, which is how do we assess corruption control? How do we see whether corruption control works or not, given that corruption is a hidden phenomenon? And at the best of times, it's very difficult to know how much corruption is occurring in a society. What many scholars do is they look at perceptions and use perceptions of corruption as a proxy for corruption. And if we take that approach, Xi's campaign has not succeeded. The Transparency International's Influential Corruption Perceptions Index suggests that in the decades since Xi launched this campaign, almost nothing has happened. There's been almost no change in China's level of corruption besides a little fluctuation here and there. But really, the campaign has done nothing to reduce corruption in China. I think, though, that that's problematic. I think perceptions are not a good metric, in particular for this study. There are a couple of reasons why. So first, I think the distance between perceptions and actual corruption, which is always an issue, is likely to be much greater for the analysis of opaque authoritarian regimes, right? When Transparency International does these surveys of outside experts, they're maybe asking some business person who lives in a Western country and does business in China. And that person is at most seeing just the corruption in their particular business or their particular industry as it relates to China, and not the holistic picture of what's happening with corruption domestically in China, which is often very hidden. And related to that, perceptions only indirectly tell us what the government actually tried to do and did or didn't achieve. Often, and there's some evidence of this, what perceptions show is a kind of overall view of a country. And so a lot of outsiders have been deeply worried by the direction that Xi Jinping has taken China in, as well as many Chinese people, but especially China's aggressive foreign policy moves and its increasing crackdowns on minorities and heating up competition with the United States All these things make for a more negative perception of China, and that's very likely to have influenced the perception of corruption, even though corruption and authoritarianism are conceptually distinct things that we should keep separate. Finally, putting authoritarianism aside, Transparency International's methodology in this index has been criticized on several grounds, and many of those critiques also apply to other indices that try to use perceptions to capture corruption. Okay, so that's a very long refutation, but what do I propose instead? Well, I suggest we look at what the campaign actually did. And I think there are two key questions there. The first is, did it enforce anti-corruption through wide-ranging investigations and prosecutions, right? Because a lot of the time, an autocrat will say that he or she is going to curb corruption and then just nothing happens. Or a little bit of something happens, or they just purge a few rivals, and it's not a kind of wide-ranging attack on corrupt actors or allegedly corrupt actors. So first, we have to see if there's actual enforcement. And second, and likely more importantly, did anti-corruption rulemaking and organizational reforms build institutional constraints on corruption, right? So if there's a lot of enforcement, if a lot of people are arrested, but then there are no rules put in place that really disincentivize corruption or that change the way the state works to reduce corruption, then anti-corruption isn't going to get very far. And so what I do throughout the book and with this campaign as one example is I take these two key features of what anti-corruption should look like, and then I break them down into different aspects and then assess each of those aspects before making a holistic assessment of whether corruption control was serious and actually had an impact. So if we take Xi's campaign and look at it that way, we can break it down a little bit. I'm not going to go really deeply into the campaign, but here are three aspects of enforcement worth considering. So first, horizontal scope. Has the campaign investigated people widely? Absolutely. This campaign has investigated more than 3 million people across all the provinces, bureaus, and economic sectors of China. And over 1 million of them have actually been disciplined for something corruption related. So immediately from that, we can see this is not a narrow vendetta against one province or against one particular problem of corruption. This is a nationwide campaign. Secondly, vertical reach. So it could be that a campaign just gets a few low-level officials and doesn't have much of a sort of national central presence. But this campaign has disciplined more than 300 high-ranking officials, and it includes some from every province and major city, dozens of heads of important state-owned enterprises, dozens of generals from the military. This is a wide-ranging campaign, even at the highest levels. And lastly, persistence. We know in some instances of anti-corruption or supposed anti-corruption, an autocrat will arrest some elites and threaten them, but then just kind of let them go. And then that obviously doesn't really change corruption. So, but here in this campaign, there's been very little backtracking, and the conviction rate is above 99% once someone is under serious investigation. And the campaign has also been unprecedentedly long in Chinese history. So it's not likely to just be suddenly over and everybody goes home and everything goes back to normal. So enforcement in different ways looks quite strong. So moving on to rulemaking, I think that the Xi administration has also strengthened the institutional structures against corruption in a number of helpful ways. So first, he strengthened the anti-corruption apparatus. He strengthened the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection and the underrated inspection system. And he's established this powerful National Supervision Commission that oversees all anti-corruption work. There's lots of evidence that there have been reforms of party and government practices that crack down on corruption, right? Economic analyses of different sectors, including those focused on land transactions, luxury goods imports, car sales, new business registrations, spending on travel and entertainment for corporations, all of these kind of economic studies point to a real impact that this campaign has had. And so I think that we can say the practices in the government have changed in ways that reduce malfeasance. Moreover, if we look just specifically at anti-corruption rules, there have been numerous laws, bureaucratic rules, and party codes that have been enhanced or built anew, such as the 8-point code, which she launched in 2012. And these we can trace over the years and see that they have not only been enacted, but also enforced. and they've been enforced with real gusto over several years across the country. So all this sounds quite positive, but I don't want to leave out the fact that this campaign also has real limitations. So I think that a key limitation of this campaign is that it doesn't systematically enforce rules that could address elite corruption. And this, of course, is a limitation that has to do with authoritarian politics in general, because no autocrat, no matter how reform-minded about the state of the state or the party state, is going to attack his own corruption, is going to attack his friend's corruption directly. And so this is likely a natural limitation on authoritarian anti-corruption reforms, and we can see it in Xi's campaign as well. In the book Red Roulette, Desmond Shroom gives a really good tell-all of these kinds of corrupt practices that the elites engage in, such as insider trading. And even though the events in the book are pre-Xi era, I think that there's little evidence that these kinds of corrupt acts have been stopped, even after the Xi administration's campaign got started. So that's a limitation on the campaign that we should definitely acknowledge. So, but overall, my verdict is that Xi's campaign has been successful in limiting government corruption. How has Xi done this? So skeptics have long contended that China needs to use more democratic methods, and agreeing with the conventional wisdom, China should adhere to global best practices to curb corruption, right? But this is not exactly what happened. So Pei Min-shin, in his book, China's Crony Capitalism, sees that true anti-corruption would require breaking the CCP's monopoly on power. And we know that hasn't happened. So how has this campaign actually worked? Well, I find that Xi has succeeded through a decidedly authoritarian approach. And to anyone paying attention to how Xi has governed in general, that won't be much of a surprise. But what I find are three characteristics of an authoritarian approach to corruption control that I also see in many other instances of autocrats curbing corruption in different countries. The first is power centralization. So in Xi's campaign, power over the campaign was very concentrated, or is still very concentrated in Xi's hands. It's all about Xi's instructions and Xi's guidance for the campaign. And he only delegates to institutions that are directly loyal to him. So this is very much at odds with what we think of as checks and balances, right? We think an independent judiciary and different branches of government should be checking each other. And that's how that's one way that corruption can be reduced, but that's not what we see here. Closely related to this, this campaign has serious top-down control. So the campaign cuts through local protectionism and bureaucratic resistance because people at the top have much more power, and there's no decentralization going on. It's not as if one city can just do its own thing. And beyond that, civil society and the public are shut out of anti-corruption work. And so you don't get that bottom-up push to oversee the government that supposedly is really important in how democracies curb corruption. So this is also very different. And lastly, I noticed a tremendous amount of censorship and propaganda focused on this campaign. Now, these are common tools for autocrats to use, but how do they help with anti-corruption campaign? Well, in this case, there's been a really coordinated strategy to sell this campaign to the public and to other party members. This campaign is necessary, it's inevitable, and it's proof that only the CCP can reform China, right? The party has even collaborated with private businesses to create popular TV dramas about how good its anti-corruption is. And so there's a lot of anti-corruption TV in China, and actually some of it's pretty good. Okay, a question that's often raised about Xi Jinping is, how Maoist is Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign? Ever since Xi took power, he has invited comparisons to Chairman Mao because of his personal power consolidation, his party first agenda, ideological and anti-Western rhetoric, and this wide-ranging crackdown on dissent that he has overseen. But at the same time, China is a very different place than it was back in the Mao era. What I find is that Xi's campaign, like much of his governance, draws on Maoist features, but really does so selectively and adapts them to a new national condition. If we look at the anti-corruption campaign specifically, there are three big differences with Mao era campaigns, including Mao era anti-corruption campaigns. The first I see is that there's no real mass mobilization, right? Chairman Mao loved empowering the masses. He loved the idea of ordinary Chinese people rising up and taking over local governments and kicking out local officials so that things would be pure and revolutionary. But every leader of China since the Cultural Revolution's chaotic disaster has been very, very hesitant to mobilize the masses in this way. And Xi Jinping, despite some of his rhetoric, is no different. This anti-corruption campaign is very stage managed. It's very top down, and it doesn't really empower the people anywhere like Mao's campaigns used to. Secondly, and relatedly, Xi's campaign is very professional and expert led. And Mao had a great suspicion of experts. He thought that they were often purposefully obfuscating things, and that ordinary people could do things just as well as long as they believed in themselves and had the proper ideological and revolutionary tools. But when the Xi administration sends out inspectors to inspect a province or a city or a financial institution, you can be sure that they have a tremendous amount of experience. They are experts, and they often have backgrounds that are particularly helpful because of their technical expertise. So they might be auditors or have certain legal knowledge that's helpful for these campaigns. And that, I think, is just a very basic reflection of the fact that China's economy has grown a lot more complicated, and finding corruption has gotten a lot harder, because not that corruption is decreased, but because it's much subtler than it used to be. And finally, and others have definitely noted this, this campaign under Xi Jinping has no endpoint. So it's almost not like a campaign at all, right? In the Mao era, campaigns came and they were like a big storm blowing through a country, and they definitely left changes behind, but they would end. They would end and people would go back to a semblance of normal. What Xi has promised, and I think delivered, is a new normal of high pressure on corruption. And so that is where we still are now, even though the campaign has slowed down in some ways. So what? What are the larger political implications here? So what if Xi's campaign has curbed corruption and has done so with authoritarian methods? I think there are a couple implications. First, this suggests that Xi is succeeding in strengthening party organization and discipline and the party state more generally. So he's achieving his goal there. I think this also helps Xi to expand party control over the state and society, to sort of roll back that political liberalization that was happening under his predecessors that he finds very threatening. So alongside there being too much corruption, Xi sees liberalization itself as threatening and as reminiscent of the mistakes of the Soviet Union, which thought it could open up to reform, but then just opened up and fell apart. From a political science perspective, I think that the regime's ability to self-reform, such as with this major anti-corruption reform, is a very positive sign for the CCP's durability going forward. This shows flexibility and adaptability in a way that some other authoritarian regimes don't have. And so finally, all of this suggests to me that there may be no contradiction in the short and medium term between greater authoritarianism and regime strength in China. Okay, that's a lot about China. In the book, I also look at authoritarian anti-corruption elsewhere in a kind of global perspective. This is Rwandan President Paul Kagame, who has ruled Rwanda with really an iron fist for more than 2 decades, but who at the same time has seriously prioritized corruption control, promising that Rwanda would be Africa's Singapore. So to look at anti-corruption in other countries, the first thing I did, and you don't need to read all this, is I made a list, a kind of data set of different anti-corruption efforts in different countries around the world, and used some basic framework to assess what happened, whether they qualify as an anti-corruption effort, and whether they were successful or unsuccessful based on secondary sources. So after taking that global data set, I zoomed in to focus on 9 main cases. And I spend most of the book analyzing anti-corruption in these cases, which are both successful and unsuccessful, attempts to curb corruption in China, Taiwan, and South Korea, the latter two before they democratize, between 1950 and the present. And I'm not going to go through them all, but in China, that includes the 3 antis, 5 antis campaign in the 50s, the 4 cleans in the 60s, the post-Tiananmen crackdown on corruption, 89, and Xi's campaign. And if there are any China experts in the audience, the question may be raised that, hey, wait a minute, those aren't anti-corruption campaigns. They had a lot of other things going on. I definitely agree with that. I think that every campaign that Mao launched was complicated and was about more than one thing. But what I'm highlighting are campaigns that had a large component that was about anti-corruption and had a large number of anti-corruption prosecutions and arrests. So that's the standard by which I include something as about corruption to analyze. And then I look at its success and failure and do some comparative analysis and come to some broader conclusions. I did a lot of research for these cases. I did 16 months of in-country research in China, South Korea, and Taiwan between 2015 and 2019. I looked at a lot of different Chinese and Korean language materials from different archival collections, libraries, and government agencies in East Asia, as well as those archives and libraries that are relevant in the US. And I did interviews, 70 interviews, including of scholars studying these topics and of former high-level officials, current and former anti-corruption investigators, prosecutors, journalists, and NGO activists. This was a lot easier in South Korea and Taiwan, but I did a little bit in China as well and got some really interesting quotes there. Here are some of the sources. You can see in the bottom in red there, that's Chiang Kai-shek scrawling handwriting. In a note to posterity, he wrote there that corruption and disunity were the real causes of the loss of China, by which he meant the Nationalist Party's loss of mainland China to the communist forces. So corruption really figured in his thinking about the evolution of China. Okay, let me review some of the main points. So I think first, we should take authoritarian anti-corruption seriously. Autocrats have incentives and sometimes the ability to reduce corruption, and anti-corruption efforts in authoritarian regimes can be very consequential. Talking about Xi's anti-corruption in particular, I argue that this sweeping campaign has enhanced enforcement and rulemaking and has therefore curbed government wrongdoing. I argue, moreover, that it has succeeded through a top-down authoritarian approach to corruption control that's at odds with the conventional wisdom, best practices, how we normally think that corruption gets curbed. And I also argue that corruption control has likely strengthened Xi's regime by improving party discipline and by addressing a major source of public discontent. And recent polling shows that public support for Xi's campaign is high, and many Chinese who previously identified corruption as a major issue now rank it far lower in their list of complaints about the government. I have lots of related research that I've been working on that kind of branched out from my dissertation now book. In one study, this first one in Perspectives on Politics, I did a sort of article length version of the book. In my second piece here, The Autocrats' Corruption Dilemma, I really look at the theoretical side of this issue and look at the dilemma of when an autocrat should curb corruption or should continue to enjoy the benefits of corruption, depending on the weighing of the pros and cons. In a third study, I look at inspections and this kind of underrated inspection system in China and how that figures into the anti-corruption that's been going on. I also have analyzed corruption control in depth in other countries, including in North Korea. So I have a kind of unusual piece there about what the role of anti-corruption is in one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And then in the China Leadership Monitor last year, I wrote a piece that explains what Xi Jinping's campaign has been up to recently. So what the second term of Xi's campaign has been like. So please check those out if you're interested. To give just some final thoughts, I want to say that today I said a lot of seemingly positive things about the Xi administration and its anti-corruption campaign, but I want to say that this study is not in praise of autocracies. it's really about seeking to understand their capacities so that we don't underestimate them. My analysis does not negate the fact that most autocrats are not even-keeled reformers, and even those who are oppressing their citizens to achieve their goals, not being accountable to their citizens, and not curbing corruption in the way that the people would want or for the benefit of the public. So that's my disclaimer on everything I've said today. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to our audience. And if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. Everyone is familiar with Zoom at this point to enter in the text of your question. So Chris, this was a phenomenal amount of research, and I like that you take on the conventional wisdom about the relationship between autocratic government and corruption. One question for you is that many scholars, many of our colleagues have noted there's been a global rise in authoritarianism in general and a retreat of democracy. And one of the hallmarks of that rise in authoritarianism has been more top-down control, the use of the law to go after liberal institutions like the media or opposition parties or political dissidents. And so when you would describe Xi Jinping's authoritarian approach, is that one you would say has been adopted outside authoritarian regimes as well?
Great question. Thank you. Yes, there's a lot of debate about whether there's a China model, whether the Xi administration is trying to push a model of itself on other countries. And in this debate, the question is really what the China model is. Because if the China model is an exact copy of China, that's never going to be exported. China doesn't want to export it. Other countries can't become China because China has too many unique characteristics and factors, economic realities and historical legacies to really be replicated. But we know that if we take a thinner view of the China model, the Xi administration is pushing several of its capacities or offering several of its capacities to other autocracies. It's helping other autocracies to improve their technology and therefore their technological surveillance and control. It's promoting its surveillance techniques, its people-to-people techniques. It's training officers, including police officers in other countries, about putting down repression. And in terms of corruption, it's also promoting its model of, hey, guess what? You too can control corruption without having to democratize. And so we see that it's promoting itself as a successful country in addressing a problem that everyone acknowledges is big. So whatever your political views, whatever ideology, whatever race you are, corruption is a negative thing. And so if China can position itself as a good governance country, then it can undercut the narrative from America that democracy is what really matters.
Right. So there's a set of scholars who have written about authoritarian-led democratization. And in some of the cases that you've studied, Taiwan, South Korea, there have been instances where an authoritarian government proceeded to democratize and allowed democratic competition between other types of political parties. And those governments were often also later successful cases of development that are known for having really strong states and capacious states. So do you think that there is a relationship between an anti-corruption campaign or successful anti-corruption effort and later democratization? Is there sort of a sticky effect that persists after a regime transition?
Interesting. I think that we should clarify that there's likely no causal relationship between good governance and later democratization. I think that would be overblown. But I think that if an authoritarian regime is able to provide some good things to its people, then of course it will be remembered more positively than those that aren't. Just like with economic growth, corruption control is something that people want and that they're willing to give credit for, even in a non-democratic context. And we see that in the best or the strongest case for this authoritarian-led democratization narrative, which is Taiwan. In Taiwan, to this day, many people will argue that the KMT was relatively clean and relatively effective in developing the economy because it was relatively clean. And that's a huge reversal of how the KMT acted on the Chinese mainland. Now, people on the Taiwanese left will tear their hair out and say that's not true. The KMT was actually very corrupt in Taiwan, but it at least has some resonance. And so it's very likely that if China were for some reason to democratize, people would remember the positive things, at least some of the positive things that the Chinese Communist Party has done and tried to do. And yeah, I would predict that that's a really important factor for those post-transition parties.
Okay, so some questions from the audience. One is Xi's approach creating a gap between corrupt elites that he sort of doesn't want to affect or touch and others that he doesn't care about? Like, is there more of a move towards oligarchy and kleptocracy like you find in Russia?
Oh, that's a great question. I would break it into two parts. So is there a gap developing? Definitely. So I definitely see that the Xi administration, like other authoritarian regimes, has limits on its anti-corruption efforts. And that naturally means that if you're a true insider, well protected by Xi, you're a close ally of Xi, you're probably pretty safe, and you may just have to become more discreet in how you act corrupt. But does this mean that China is changing and becoming more like Russia? I would say absolutely not. And I think that Russia and China have key differences in how their regimes operate in ways that are relevant to corruption. So Putin's regime is really based on corrupt exchanges. From all the secondary literature I've read, this is very much the conventional wisdom about authoritarian regimes and corruption. Putin hands out spoils and opportunities to embezzle and opportunities to be corrupt, and that's where he gets his key support. Xi is not like that. Xi does not rule primarily through handing out or doling out opportunities to engage in corruption. He rules and is powerful primarily because of his positions in a powerful institution, the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a lot of corruption in that institution, but the institution itself is not based on corruption. It's not fundamental to what the institution is. And so I think that Xi Jinping can reduce corruption overall and strengthen the Communist Party. But if Putin were to try to do that, it wouldn't work at all, because corruption is foundational to his support network. So I see this as a big divergence and a big way in which China under Xi is much stronger as an authoritarian regime than Putin's regime in Russia.
Okay, to follow up on that, so you have authoritarian governments that may want to exercise political control, but they also want the economy to do well. So there are some tensions here with how you treat your sort of capitalist or kleptocratic oligarchic elite. And there have been some moves by the Xi Jinping regime to crack down arbitrarily on certain business leaders. Does that create a chilling effect in the business community? Do you think that it has some consequences for growth or for the development of Chinese capitalism?
If we're talking about those recent actions, such as against Jack Ma, that have been making headlines, I definitely agree that those were rash and seem to have now been partly walked back because of the economic consequences and because of the perception around them. But to tack this sort of to my research, many have argued that anti-corruption will have a similarly negative effect. And so autocrats shouldn't do it because it will suppress the economy, or Xi Jinping shouldn't be too anti-corruption because then people will be too scared to do anything. And bureaucrats and capitalists will be shivering with fear in their homes, and the economy will stall and slow down. China's aware of this problem. The Xi administration has tried all sorts of ways to balance these facts, but they believe that ultimately to move China's economy forward, to switch from input gains to efficiency gains, to make the economy more efficient, there needs to be a reduction of corruption, almost whatever the costs, even if there's a cost that it slows down the economy somewhat. So I think that there may be a cost, but in terms of the anti-corruption campaign, the Xi administration is willing to pay it.
Okay, so there are a few questions actually along the lines of this sort of never-ending campaign that you said created differences between the current Xi Jinping, anti-corruption campaign and Mao's. So people are pointing out that the number of corruption cases has gone up in later Xi terms, and also might this just be a strategy of institutionalizing authoritarian rule, that you're sort of under a permanent anti-corruption campaign?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because when this campaign was young, a few years old, and I was just starting out doing my research on it, I was told two things about it. One, that it couldn't last, that this campaign would have to end because it was just too high pressure, and campaigns always end. And secondly, that campaigns are deinstitutionalizing, that campaigns, they violate institutions in order to push for the goals that the party or the leadership want. But what I've seen over the years is that this campaign, or now this non-campaign, is that it has violated both of those predictions. The campaign has not ended, nor I think has it deinstitutionalized. I think that the campaign has involved a lot of institution building. It has strengthened anti-corruption, and that sort of belies some of the revolutionary rhetoric that Xi has around the campaign. But the campaign really involves a lot of bureaucracy building. It's just that they're building bureaucracy in ways that sort of penetrate old bureaucracies and sort of renew them, or they might strengthen and make regular inspections, but that is an institution that is meant to put fear in the ordinary bureaucratic institutions. So in a way, yes, this is institutionalizing. This is institutionalizing a permanent authoritarian regime, Xi hopes.
Okay. There's another question here that is sort of similar to what we talked about before with whether or not other sort of hybrid authoritarian leaders are pursuing authoritarian anti-corruption strategies. Someone's asking about Modi in India, who has often justified certain policies as a way to eliminate corruption. So, do you find some resonances there? China model aside, is this sort of rhetorically something that you've seen even democratically elected leaders engaging in?
I have. I am not an expert on the Indian case, but I have noted that really since the 1990s, there has been a steady growth in public expectations about leadership. And so for various reasons that I get into in one article that I wrote, public expectations for corruption control have increased, and leaders have responded to that either by using greater repression or by getting smart and trying to get on the right side of the issue. And so now everyone is attacking their opponents for being corrupt. And in some cases, they're right, but it's also very commonly used as a simple political maneuver. And so what I try to do in my methodology section in my book is give people tools that they can use to look at an anti-corruption effort or an announced anti-corruption effort and say, is this serious? How do we know? Well, let's look at what Chris lays out here. And judging by these metrics, is this serious anti-corruption, or is it just about purging rivals?
Right. Okay. So there's a set of questions that is sort of asking about the levels of government and the sort of penetration of this anti-corruption campaign. Like, first of all, are there workarounds being created where there's sort of been a perpetuation of corruption or a way of breeding more of it in different venues or arenas? And alternatively, does it become less effective as you go down a bureaucratic or administrative hierarchy? Do you find that, enforcement differs, that kind of thing?
Right. It has often been hypothesized that when corruption is attacked, it hides, and that corruption returns in different forms that are more subtle. This is undoubtedly happening in some cases. I've heard anecdotally of some extremely clever forms of corruption that have emerged. But I think that the evidence, the economic and legal evidence, is so consistent across many different analyses or different areas in the economy that something big has happened to change cadres' behavior overall. And so I'm not going to deny that there is this giant unseen factor. There could be this giant unseen factor that I can't observe. But from what I can observe, it seems that this campaign is much more serious and more successful than many of the others I compare it to. And so that's maybe an unsatisfactory answer, but it's the best I can do there. On the question of whether top-down governance becomes less effective at lower levels, that would normally be true. What the Xi administration has tried to do to counteract that is to motivate lower level leaders to replicate the top-down system in their area. So just as there is a national inspection leading group that sends inspectors down to provinces and cities have set up their own inspection teams that then go down to counties and lower levels to search for corruption. And so if each level can create upward accountability, then Xi can achieve his dream of trying to replace democratic accountability in toto and keep people honest with the fear that something will happen to them if they break the rules. How successful that is at certain lower levels, I honestly can't say, because China is very large and gets very diverse at the lower levels. But certainly at the national level, on the aggregate, and at the central levels, we can see serious change.
So as we sort of wrap up here, you started this research a while ago when you thought, you had certain assumptions about why autocrats engage in anti-corruption campaigns and how successful Xi's campaign would be. And in that time, the world has changed a lot, both in Asia and also here in the United States and every place in between. What are some of the most surprising things? You've told us about some things that surprised you along the course of your research, but what are some things about changes in the world itself that have been surprising to you, and how do they, relate to the topics that you take up in your book?
Well, what a nice open-ended question. I have been surprised. I think first, I was surprised by the retreat of democracy that I began to accelerate just as I was beginning this research, and that has now hurt many democracies and ended many democracies around the world. And I don't think that's the same as China, Russia, regimes that were already very authoritarian, but I think that those regimes have benefited from that. And I think that what I couldn't see at the time was that Xi's attempts to reform China domestically were not just about preventing further domestic unrest. They were also about strengthening China to go outward and to move outward into what became a more hospitable global environment. So once the party is more organized and disciplined domestically, then it has more energy to go out to preach its message, and also to push the Belt and Road to new heights. And so I didn't see that connection coming. And then a second thing, which I don't think anyone really saw coming, is COVID-19. And as we saw, China play the central role in the world's response, the initial response, and then the harshest response, and now a very troubled response. China's been at the center of the action this whole time. And the connection to my work I see there is that many of the tools that China about 10 years ago pioneered or enhanced to address the scourge of corruption, it then turned to the scourge of COVID-19. So in a way, corruption is like a virus. You've got to stamp it out. You've got to stamp out connections, and you've got to lock people down. And so this is like a really extreme example. COVID is like a really extreme example of the kind of techniques of top-down control that Xi first used to get corruption, but then once he built them, he started using them for all sorts of things. And in fact, he did use anti-corruption inspectors to make sure that COVID lockdown was being enforced from very early on in his response to COVID-19. So those are two big things. I mean, sure, there are other things that have surprised me along the way.
I know, but it's been a long journey. We won't make you go through all of them. In closing, final question. What do you think, policymakers have turned increasing attention to China? And I think Biden, if it weren't for a pandemic here and a sort of reestablishment of democratic order, would, and of course, Russian invasion of Ukraine, he would probably be much more focused on China. He sort of said yesterday that we're going to defend Taiwan no matter what. What is your research if you could have, 2 seconds with policymakers who are trying to think about our trade and political and, military response to China, what do you think are some of the most important takeaways for them as they formulate policy?
I think that, well, two things. First, don't underestimate the Communist Party's ability to adapt itself, to be flexible, and to address domestic problems. So don't expect that they will lead to some breakdown in China. But secondly, people are not focused enough on how China's corruption is key in its foreign influence operations. So China corrupting foreign officials, China using economic coercion and the corrupt component of that to influence other countries. This is really, really big because economic might is why China is so powerful and important. And if it can't influence people with its soft power, and if it can't win friends, then at least it can have a really big impact through economic influence. And the sharpest edge of that is its use of corruption. And that's increasing. And I don't think people are paying enough attention to that.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for this really interesting and engaging talk. Thank you to our audience for tuning in. Congratulations on your book. We're so excited to see it out. Everyone check it out if you can. And we look forward to seeing the next phases of your research and your work, and hope everybody out there stays safe.
Thank you all. Thank you, Didi, so much.